Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Clarissa's Corner. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into the novel The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. Throughout this course, we've looked at various works, but the two that I'm going to be pointing out, along with The Handmaid's Tale, are Frankenstein and Hamlet. I feel like as we work on understanding The Handmaid's Tale, it kind of is helpful to connect it and compare it to the other things that we've looked at throughout this course, to better understanding, bigger our brain. So I want to start by kind of taking a look into the theme of isolation. Isolation is something that we see a lot, and there's definitely layers to it. So in The Handmaid's Tale, isolation is used really as a means of control, particularly against the women. The handmaids are really isolated from everyone. Really minimal interaction is allowed between the handmaids themselves. And apart from that, the handmaids are really in their room. They're kind of seen as a social, not necessarily social outcast, but they're not a part of society, really. And I feel like a quote that kind of demonstrates the kind of control part is that Offred has been isolated from her family for so long, so when Serena Joy wants her to do something, she's like, I might, kind of emphasizes maybe, will give you a photo of your daughter if you do what I want you to do. So Offred has been isolated from her daughter and Luke for so long, and because Serena Joy knows that she's been isolated, she knows that she can use this as a means to get her to do what she wants. And then with isolation, we also see that a lot in Frankenstein, but we kind of more see the effect of isolation on individuals rather than how isolation can be used for control. So kind of some different examples of the isolation are the creature being isolated from the community and relationships kind of made him turn to evil. Victor Frankenstein isolated himself from the people around him when he was creating the monster, and at the end when Elizabeth was isolated from Victor, that was actually when the creature When we look at the creature, we see that he was isolated from society and rejected by everyone he encounters, and because of this, his loneliness grows into an anger and a desire. It's really the cause and effect, right? And then with Victor Frankenstein, his isolation was more self-imposed when he was creating the creature, right? He cut himself off from his family, his friends, but his isolation causes him to neglect his responsibilities with the creature, which you could say definitely contributes to the various tragedies that occur throughout the book. It also shows that isolation can have really destructive effects on individuals. Not only does it focus on isolation, it also focuses on the effect. So unlike in The Handmaid's Tale, where isolation, it's just control, isolation in Frankenstein leads to suffering and emotional damage and violence. But both texts do show the importance of human connection and how it really is essential, and that being separated from others can really have serious consequences, as we saw. And then, so with this, we're going to take a feminist lens to both the books. We can see how women are isolated and denied in power in The Handmaid's Tale, while Frankenstein, again, shows the consequences of excluding and marginalizing those who do not fit into society's expectations, right? So in The Handmaid's Tale, women are separated into really strict and strictly enforced social classes, right? We have the handmaids, the wives, the Marthas, and the aunts. So, right, the handmaids are discouraged from forming relationships with one another, and there's really no interaction between any of them. The wives and the handmaids is very little, because it's obvious for the most part the wives don't exactly like the handmaids, and then the Marthas, they kind of are almost their whole thing, and it's very kind of individual with what their relationship would be with the handmaids. And then again, the aunts are their whole other thing, because while they do have power, it's still the men. And then in Frankenstein, Elizabeth, Justine, and Caroline, who are kind of the only female characters that we see, have really little influence over the events in the novel. And the women still even though we see little of them, it's very obvious that they're confined to the traditional roles, right? Either mother or romantic partner. That's really all we see. For example, Elizabeth depends on Victor for information and protection. And then so if we're going to put them together, we would see that in both texts, women are limited over their own lives and futures, and their lack of power leaves them very vulnerable to the decisions of others, which is the men, really leaves them in a vulnerable state. And as I mentioned, like, isolation is used differently in each text. So in The Handmaid's Tale, women are like deliberately isolated to make them easier to control. And then in Frankenstein, the women are excluded from positions of power and often isolated from important decisions that like affect their lives. The feminist then like really highlights, I think it does a good job at highlighting unequal power structures and how those can lead to isolation, right? Like, so Gilead physically and socially separates women to maintain male authority, and then in Frankenstein it shows that when certain groups are denied voice, they become powerless and suffer the consequences of others' actions. And then, so I thought that kind of another interesting thing to look at, or maybe not so interesting, it's very in your face in The Handmaid's Tale, is the men in power and the control of others. And then I also kind of compared this to the reading of Hamlet. So in both The Handmaid's Tale and Hamlet, it shows that men in positions of power influence and control the lives of others, which causes suffering and limiting individual freedom. So we see that the male authority is used to control women's bodies in The Handmaid's Tale. Honestly, the list could just go on of the power that the men have, but I feel like the two kind of biggest ones to point out is that they have control over the reproduction, and, well, I guess 3, the commanders hold all political and social power. And then something that I thought was interesting is that the handmaids do not have their own identity at all. They are of, and then the commander's name. So for example, Offred is of Fred. Fred is her commander, so she is Fred, essentially. So with Offred, we see that she like really has, I mean, with all the handmaids anyways, have very little control over their lives, and their value is determined by male leaders and their ability to bear children, and that's it. And the men in power like kind of create laws to benefit themselves, and then the women become dependent on male authority, and that's how Gilead maintains control, by limiting women's freedoms. And then in Hamlet, the men in positions of authority use their power to influence and manipulate the people around them, right? So Claudius gains power by murdering King Hamlet and taking the throne. And then Polonius controls, like, there's a bunch of others, but I feel like another good one to mention is Polonius controlling Ophelia's actions to tell her how to behave. There's like a quote here, but essentially he's telling her what to do, and it's like, you do it or I'm going to do it. And it's very much like she doesn't really have much of a choice. With Claudius, we see that he uses his authority to protect his position as king. And then with Ophelia, she's affected by male power, right? Like, she's expected to obey both her father and her brother. Like, there's times where her brother's telling her what to do and she's just kind of sitting there listening. And then her lack of independence, right? That could or potentially be linked to her tragic downfall. Right? Like, she didn't really have much say in anything, so it could be said that that's what led her to doing what she did. And like, Shakespeare kind of shows how power can be abused when leaders place their own interests above the like well-being of others. And again, I want to take the feminist lens rather, and take a look at this, because it kind of shows how both texts portray societies where men hold the majority of power and women are essentially to be obedient and dependent, and that's it, right? So in The Handmaid's Tale, the women are denied political, economic, and educational rights. Female roles are strictly controlled by men. And in Hamlet, or how I would like to call it, Hammy, Ophelia is expected to obey Polonius and Laertes. And then there's also like Gertrude's actions are frequently judged and criticized by the male characters. And again, the women have really little influence over political decisions. So if we're like to kind of look at Ophelia and Offred, both struggle with expectations that have been imposed by men in power, and their freedom is limited by the patriarchal system. Additionally, like, the feminist lens, like, I feel like it really shows unequal power relationships. Men make the decisions while women are just expected to follow them. And female voices are usually ignored or dismissed as if they weren't there. And it kind of both shows how systems dominated by men can restrict women's independence and shape who they end up becoming, right? Like with Ophelia, it could be said that how she was treated could be the reason why she killed herself. And with Offred, her identity is her commander. And while she spends time reminiscing on her life before she was a handmaid, she is a handmaid now, and that's it. So kind of like through the actions of the powerful male figures and experiences of women living under their authority, in The Handmaid's Tale and Hammy, it shows how power can be used to control others, which like limits freedom and creates inequality within societies, which is a big one. Like the inequality within societies is kind of a given outcome from this. Overall, the different books that we've read throughout the course, specifically Frankenstein and the Hamlet, have really given us like a better view and understanding of The Handmaid's Tale, the different implications and things that we can learn from it. Thank you so much for tuning in to Clarissa's Corner this week. I hope you tune in next week. Who knows what we're going to be exploring next, and don't forget to smile.